A baby's first sounds and words are an important milestone for all parents. We all assume our children will develop speech and take it for granted once it first appears. But how do children actually acquire language? In the first half of the 20th century, behaviorist psychologists theorized that all learning, including learning a language, involves the process of stimulus and response. They theorized that language begins to develop when children begin to produce their first sounds and parents reward them by taking them in their arms and speaking to them in a form of parentese. At a very early age, this type of reinforcement encourages children to repeat their babbling, thus beginning a long process that through imitation allows them to develop language proficiency. Various behaviorists such as Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner conducted many experiments with lab animals to study and document the effects of conditioning. Skinner also used members of his own family to examine the effects of operant conditioning, devising a method in which he was able to train one of his daughters to lose her fear of slides as a young girl. Following the tenets of behaviorism and his own experience in the lab, Skinner theorized that a child's environment, his language models, will be the primary source of stimulus in his language development. Positive reinforcement will advance language development, negative reinforcement will delay it. Beginning in the late 1950s, behaviorist theories began to fall out of favor as psychologists, linguists, and educators attempted to address inconsistencies in the application of behaviorism to language development. For example, if a child's unique environment is a factor in how he or she will learn language, why is it that the stages of language development occur at about the same ages in most children, regardless of their environment? How can behaviorism explain the rapid rate at which children learn language? If children learn language based on imitating their parents and caregivers, why is it that children make language mistakes such as "Billy hit at me" when they try to express an event that took place in the past, when errors like these aren't the type of errors they would generally hear in adult language? How do children acquire proper language skills when their parents and caregivers do not correct their mistakes? These researchers went back to square one and attempted to answer a very basic question. Does a child learn language in the same way that she learns other things, such as tying her shoes? Or is language acquisition an example of a biological predisposition for language? In the early 1970s, Roger Brown studied 3 children, beginning at 12 months of age until early school age, concentrating on the type of speech they produced. In order to measure and compare their speech, Brown developed a tool he called Mean Length of Utterance, or MLU. In his study, Brown noted all the utterances the 3 children made, and then broke each utterance down into their total number of morphemes. Morphemes are the smallest indivisible unit of meaning in a language. For example, the word happy is 1 morpheme, while unhappy is 2, as it contains both un and happy, which are each morphemes. Brown counted the total number of morphemes the children used and divided them by the total number of utterances. With this information, Brown was able to identify and eventually predict the type of utterances children make at 5 important stages of their development. In the 1990s, Steve Pinker elaborated on Brown's work. His studies demonstrated the consistencies of language development among children from all language families. These include: children develop the physical capacity for language during their first 12 months, and first demonstrated in their use of babble. At about 7 months, this babble undergoes a substantial change, and children begin to produce sounds using a consonant vowel structure such as ba or d. At about 1 year, children begin to produce individual words. Children throughout every culture produce the same types of words. These one-word utterances are also labeled telegraphic speech because one word can represent a complex thought. At 18 months, children begin to form 2-word sentences using correct syntax. They also begin to greatly expand their vocabulary, learning a new word every 2 hours. In a very important study that demonstrated the universality of language development in all children, neuroscientist Laura Ann Petito documented language development in deaf children. She found that these children went through the same language development stages as those described by Pinker, giving further evidence that language, and the role language plays, is a part of our biological makeup. Petitto theorizes that children are born with a propensity to acquire language, and that there are no limitations to what form that language can take. But there is still a clear impact of our environment and how well we learn language. Educator Gordon Wells studied the language development of 32 students, beginning with students as young as 15 months old and through elementary school. Wells found that those children who were constantly having their language mistakes corrected did not develop a more error-free use of language, but instead became inhibited in their speech, which negatively impacted their academic success. On the other hand, those children whose parents and caregivers concentrated on understanding them and their meaning without offering any corrections, adapted a better sense of language and achieved greater academic success. In fact, Gordon Wells titled one of his lectures, "Children Talk Their Way into Literacy." American linguist Noam Chomsky theorizes that all children are born with an innate capacity for language, which he calls a language acquisition device. This is a specialized area of the brain designed exclusively for language development. The LAD contains the basic structures of all human languages, which he calls the universal grammar. This universal grammar is not a complete knowledge of any language, such as English or Spanish, but instead is the knowledge of those elements which are common to all languages. In Chomsky's theory, a child does not develop language from scratch, but instead needs to learn the rules that govern his or her native language. For example, all languages have something like prepositions, words that show relationships among things. In Chomsky's theory, a child is born with the implicit knowledge that there are words that serve as nouns, which name things, and words that serve as prepositions, which show relationships between things. But the child needs to learn how these two words are grouped in his native language. Chomsky calls this learned ability parameter setting. Along with his LAD theory, Chomsky also worked developing a theory about what makes it possible for individuals to create a limitless number of sentences in their native language. Chomsky suggests that we are all equipped with generative grammar, a limited number of rules that we use to understand the types of sentences we can or cannot produce. He also suggests that these rules have already been mastered by the time we begin school. In order to validate his theory of generative grammar, Chomsky studied the types of errors children make when they are learning their native language. In his research, Chomsky found that when children made errors in their speech, these errors weren't due to a random and unstructured use of language, but instead were examples of the overgeneralized use of specific rules. For example, a young child might say, "I bring my toys to play with," instead of "I brought my toys to play with." She is showing an understanding of the use of the past tense of irregular verbs and using it in a logical but incorrect way. We all develop language, whether it is a spoken language or a signs language. We all learn the rules for language before we are ever put into a school environment. We are all able to produce sentences that we have never heard before, both as young children and as adults. Clearly, there is an innate language device that facilitates our language acquisition, or how would any of this be possible? Chomsky, Brown, Petitto, and the other researchers have come up with a convincing argument in the age-old debate of whether language is an example of nurture versus nature or nature versus nurture.